Epistemological implications for research on the marginalized. Epistemology explores how knowledge, truth, and understanding were shaped by social and cultural forces, and we question, how do we make sense of and study what we see? Epistemologically, what did society know about disability and other aspects of marginalization when Anne Webster was writing poetry? We got to think about how do these frameworks exclude or limit certain voices, and we can do this by examining how the poet's work was received or not received in their time, and we can explore how certain forms of knowledge were rendered invisible or erased by dominant narratives. So when we think about the historical perception of the differently abled by society during Anne Webster's lifetime, she herself wrote in Solitary Musings, "To those who have accustomed themselves to suppose that the loss of sight is necessarily accompanied by the loss of all sensibility, I would say the loss of sight does not turn the unfortunate sufferer into stone." So when we think about the historical perception of the differently abled by society, I turn to Oliphant, 2006, who records in Britain voluntary schools or asylums first appeared to offer moral improvement, industrial training, and religious consolation to the blind. Liverpool School opened in 1791, others followed, and blind institutions patronized by elites soon symbolized the success of local philanthropy, becoming objects of civic pride. So in 1791, we have Liverpool School, which opens. Anne Webster was born in 1797. However, she was not blind until the 8th year of her life. So when we think about this school, for those who were financially well off, they could attend the school. However, there was a second option for those who were not as financially privileged, and that was the asylum or an institution. Oliphant continues that two other motives probably influenced the choice of the institutional approach. One was the deep-rooted concern that the blind represented a potential burden on society, and a further justification for their incarceration was the long-held perception of their otherness. And we saw Anne speak on her own identity, how as she initially felt as if she were other. However, later in the introduction of Solitary Musing, Anne Webster uses her personal experience and categorizes the two types of people that she encountered. She claims that the first group approaches with astonishment. They will ask you a number of foolish and ridiculous questions, which would operate very powerfully upon your risible muscle. If you could determine whether it would be more proper to laugh or weep, questions, however, which plainly indicate that they expected to find you complete idiots, and were it right to ridicule folly and laugh at your ignorance, yet the mind averting with the velocity of the lightning to the cause of your peculiar situation strictly forbids the one, as it as forcibly prevents the other, and there is no alternative, but that of answering such questions with as much patience as the nature of the circumstances will allow. Now, the second group tends to transpose supernatural abilities, and Anne writes, "There are others who suppose that it is by some powers miraculous that you are able to transact the common affairs of life, and the several stations you may occupy. They will even attribute to you mighty exploits which you never performed, and sensibilities to which you have no claim, because you are able to distinguish one object from another, and tell the voice of a friend from that of a stranger. And I have frequently heard it remarked that when God takes away one faculty, he gives it in some other way, as though the Almighty created something on purpose to supply the deficiency in case of privation of sight or speech." So we have Anne, who later tends to embrace her blindness as she tends to weaponize this blindness and claim that this makes her a more appropriate poet. So even though from the ontological perspective, this suggests that her blindness and societal position shaped her identity as a poet, but epistemologically we can understand how Webster's poetry was rendered trivial or a novelty and erased by the dominant narrative, as we saw in the critics' critiques of her. When we look at the literary impact and we think about recovering these marginalized voices, and specifically the marginalized voice of Anne Webster, Anne writes, though my performance does not possess the terrific sublimity of a Milton, the dulcet pathos of a Young, the majestic solemnity of a Blair, or the wild romantic enthusiasm of a Byron, yet I hope it want not good sense, moral purity, and correctness of style to give it a passport into the hands of the rising generation. Now, Claire Macdonald Shaw, who has been a critic of Anne's poetry, she actually wrote a small essay on the self-taught female poets that were found in John Clare's library. There is a volume of Solitary Musings. I knew that it had been gifted to John Clare. However, I discovered here that it was gifted to John Clare by a sincere admirer, Thomas Roberts. And that name was familiar because within the William Rogerson letters, Anne had actually spoke of Thomas Roberts, and she wrote him a poem, and it is entitled An Epistle to a Friend, T.R. Ruskington. And so here is the poem itself. It begins here. She begins with a small snippet of Dr. Young, and as we go through the poem, she mentions Thomas Roberts by name, which is incredibly interesting. So as we think about the literary impact, we also have to think about the bias and the systemic structures that were in place when Anne was publishing. Shaw suggests that there is little to no merit to Anne Webster's poetry. However, she only had access to the volume Solitary Musings. She did not have access to the other poems that Anne had written, nor the Grolier library collection that I've discovered since. But she writes, I've been asked whether the exhumation of lost women poets is a useful exercise, but are they any good? To this I have no easy reply, as I am not trying to make them fit a canonical model of excellence. The excitement of rediscovering the powerful work of 18th century self-taught writers like Leopold and Yearsley, good by traditional critical standards, imagination, and verbal energy, can lead to disappointment with the literary achievement of minor later figures like Webster. Lack of education and experience, when combined with restrictive concepts of decorum and religious indoctrination, will show, and it is easy to find and mock ambitiously awkward lines. But I am certain that hearing their voices at least must give us a better understanding of the broader social and cultural context of the Romantic verse. To many women writing at the time, the word good suggested moral rather than the aesthetic excellence, or a combination of both. But the aims of the moralist and of the artist are usually incompatible. This can be seen in the Clare Library text of Anne Webster's Solitary Musings. So the subjective nature of good poetry is questioned by Shaw. However, the experience recorded within this marginalized poet's body of work, Anne Webster, is not simply good or bad. I would argue it is invaluable. Now, in Solitary Musings, many of Webster's poems are religious in nature. However, the poems that I have found in the digital archive speak on socio and political and biographical issues, which Shaw would not have been privy to at the time of her writing the article in 1994.